we should talk a little bit about some highlights from the Jonathan Zittrain readings. You read two chapters, The Battle of the Boxes and Battle of the Networks, and what they were generally referring to and talking about were these battles that were taking place within or around the internet, both in terms of the hardware and then the software, the infrastructure that we're using. And much of it was talking about what he refers to as a generative net. And this generative or generative net is really one of the key fundamental features of the internet itself. He defines this, or it can be defined as essentially that the internet is designed to accept contributions that follow a basic set of rules. And what that means in a more accessible way is that the fundamental element of the internet is that computers themselves and the internet as an infrastructure were built to be reprogrammed and repurposed, both by the original creators and by general users, as well as businesses that are actually creating software and hardware for it. So this repurposing ability is something that has created or allowed for this evolutionary process which happens online. That was not always the case. That's a big part of what the Battle of the Boxes and Battle of the Networks were really talking about. The early alternatives, and some of these alternatives are making a comeback in some ways, included general purpose machines that were maintained by one company, like the IBMs of the world, that would give you one big computing box, and then they would do everything needed to maintain it and provide the information and the software. And also specialized appliances like word processors or coffee machines, for that matter. Things that did one thing, and they did one thing really well. They could be cheaper, they were probably simpler. And while we're probably not going to be moving from a smartphone to some simplified device, think about how you use your smartphone now, right? We have apps on the phone that do one thing, and they do one thing well. And as we are continually using apps more and more and using the internet less and less, or using apps, I should say, to do what we used to do online, we're using those apps to do specified things that have barriers and have boundaries to them. And so some of these previous more static or more controlled abilities or opportunities that we had to interact with information are now making a comeback in many ways. There's no doubt that when we talk about the Battle of the Boxes and the Battle of the Networks, that companies tried to monopolize our information and tried to monopolize how we were able to access it. Those are companies like IBM that tried to monopolize computers, and AT&T, which tried to monopolize networks. That makes sense, I guess, from a business standpoint in terms of the goal, but it's important to note that the courts and the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, maintained the ability of third parties to both modify and improve on the networks or the actual hardware that we use. And in doing so, they help to maintain the generative model that Zittrain thinks is so central, and I think that we could all agree is so important to the continued evolution of what the internet actually is. What's really important to note here is that this is not guaranteed to continue. The ideas about regulating the internet, regulating the hardware, regulating these tools that we're using to access the internet are very much in doubt, and or very much up in the air, I should say. And so it will be interesting to note how well this generative process and these generative tools are maintained moving forward.